So this little thing right here is an anamorphic lens for the iPhone, and it is from a company called Sandmarc, who very kindly sent this to me a few weeks ago. I've never used any anamorphic lens of any sort for any camera, so I'm completely new to anamorphic lenses, but I'm very interested by them. Is this one any good? We'll try and find out in this video. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
So all that footage just then was shot on the Sandmarc anamorphic lens with the iPhone 12 Pro, and we'll talk more about what this lens is for and what you can do with it in just a moment. But first up, there are a few different characteristics that are typical with an anamorphic lens. This is a lens for an iPhone, so it is a lot smaller than a typical lens, but at the front on an anamorphic lens you have a curved piece of glass, whereas on a normal lens like I'm using right now, I'm using the Tamron 17 to 28mm, it has a circular flat piece of glass on the front, and inside that lens is even more curved glass, all circular, to help shape the light into the camera's sensor. With an anamorphic lens you have a square curved piece of glass on the front, which what that means is you can get a much wider field of view. So for example, anamorphic 50mm lens gives you a much wider field of view than a typical 50mm lens would. So what that means is you are seeing much more on your screen because you have a much wider field of view, even though you might be shooting at the same focal length. But what that also means is you get those black bars at the top and bottom of the picture, because what you have to do is de-squeeze that footage, because when you shoot your anamorphic footage, because you're trying to squeeze so much more into the sensor, you have to then de-squeeze that footage to be able to see everything normally. And that is what you see in all of the movies. You get this nice widescreen view and it just draws you into the image so you feel like you're there because you can see much more. Now the second characteristic of an anamorphic lens is you get an oval shaped bokeh, whereas with a normal circular lens you get a round shaped bokeh. But probably the most famous characteristic of an anamorphic lens is the flares that you get when you shine lights directly at the lens. You can get loads of incredible looking flares that just add that something extra to your footage and make it stand out and just look cinematic, and they look incredible. So all of these three characteristics put together, the wide field of view, the oval shaped bokeh, the incredible lens flares you get, just help create this nice cinematic footage that looks incredible and it draws you into that image even more. So that is effectively what this is aiming to do with the iPhone. However, this costs 50 quid or around about 50 quid. A normal typical anamorphic lens, a lot more expensive. Like a hell of a lot more expensive. Thousands. They cost so much, a decent anamorphic lens. But this is a lot cheaper and a lot more cost effective than a typical anamorphic lens. However, the only downside, you're gonna have to shoot it on an iPhone. iPhones do shoot great footage. You can get some incredible results from an iPhone. I'm not a big fan of mobile cinematography though. I think you can always tell that it is shot on an iPhone usually, just my personal preference, although you can get some decent results. So Sandmarc did very kindly send me this lens for free to try out. However, they haven't asked me to say anything in particular about it, so all these opinions are my own. If you are interested in it though, I will drop a link in the description down below so you can go and have a look. This particular one is the 1.55 times squeeze. However, you can also get a 1.3 times squeeze, all personal preference. But the way it works is you also have to get this Sandmarc case that clips onto your iPhone just like a normal case. And on the back of it you have almost like 3 screw plates, so you can then just screw the lens onto the lens that you want to be using to shoot with. So in this particular case I just used the normal camera, I didn't use the ultra wide or the telephoto. And then what you want to do is there is 2 lines, I'm not sure if you can see this very well, and you want to line those up perfectly, because what happens if it's slightly twisted, everything will look completely distorted. So you want to keep those lines as straight as you possibly can all the time, and you want to constantly be checking that. And that is one thing that I really don't like about this lens, because when you're shooting, especially if you're shooting with an iPhone, I just want to be able to hit record and capture the footage that I want. I don't want to be worrying about lining different lines up to make sure everything is straight and then slightly knocking it, for example, while I'm moving around taking the shot. Not a big problem, I know, but just slightly annoying. So once you have your lens on your camera, you can open up the camera app and shoot whatever you want to. However, what you will notice is everything looks completely distorted. So if I show you this, for example, you can see the camera looks incredibly squashed. And that's because you are shooting with that wider field of view, because you've got the curved piece of glass drawing more light into the camera. So everything looks completely squashed. So what you can do is you can download an app called Filmic Pro. And what this allows you to do is, you can see here we have Filmic Pro open and it looks exactly the same. But what this allows you to do is you click on the settings tab and then go hardware. You can scroll down to the anamorphic adapter, and because this is a 1.5 times squeeze, we're going to click 1.5 times squeeze, and instantly you can see once you de-squeeze the footage, that is what we are going to be viewing when we come to edit the video in just a little bit. So you can see in your preview what the footage is going to look like, which is incredibly useful. And you can see, I'm fairly close to the camera now, you can see just how wide you really can see. Now, one thing I do really like about using this anamorphic adapter with the iPhone is that you get the iPhone's image stabilization. Now that means that you can just walk behind a subject. For example, I was following Holly whilst filming her before, and I was just walking handheld using the iPhone, and because the iPhone's image stabilization is so good, it's almost like using a gimbal. Now obviously it's not the same as using a gimbal with a real camera, but you can get some incredibly stable footage using just the iPhone, so you don't need to potentially worry about using a gimbal with your iPhone. I think this camera's dropping down, I'm just gonna lift it up. 1 second. Is that better? So going back to image stabilization, what that means is that just by sticking this anamorphic lens adapter onto your phone and walking and following your subject, you are going to instantly be able to get much more cinematic results from your iPhone than you would using just the normal camera on your iPhone without the adapter. Now the lens flares do actually look fairly decent from this as well. I was actually quite impressed. Now I've only tested this in broad daylight. I'm hoping to go out a little bit later on and try it in the dark so we can use some street lights to create some nice anamorphic flares. However, shining it at the sun, you get a nice long anamorphic flare across the screen, and Holly also shone her torch of her iPhone directly down the lens, and you can see that you do get some really nice flares. Now the problem with shooting with an iPhone, and this is the same just using a normal camera on an iPhone, you get those really annoying, I like to call them ghost flares. They look like kind of green dots and they just float around in all of your iPhone video and pictures. Really annoying. And you do tend to still get that when you are using this as well, which is slightly annoying, but it looks a little bit more normal, because if you're mixing them with anamorphic flares, it can look kind of cool. But the flares, they look okay through this. Now they're not going to look as good as using a real anamorphic lens, obviously, because as we mentioned, they cost thousands. This costs 50, 60 quid. But if you want that kind of look from your iPhone and you are into iPhone cinematography and creating videos with your iPhone, this might be something that you want to look at to help create more interesting looking videos, or just more cinematic looking videos. Now cinematic could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, because there's so much that goes into that one word. There's no one such thing that means that image is cinematic, because it could be lighting, it could be different lenses, for example. There's so much that goes into it. However, if you use an iPhone to shoot your videos and you want to create more cinematic footage, a little anamorphic lens adapter like this one could be the perfect way for you to do that. So the oval shaped bokeh that you tend to get on a real anamorphic lens is pretty difficult to replicate with an iPhone and an anamorphic adapter, simply because you don't get much depth of field with an iPhone because the sensors are so small. Now yes, there is cinematic mode that is starting to get better, but it's not the same as using a real camera with a real lens and creating real depth of field. That being said though, what you do tend to get with an anamorphic lens is around the edges, because it is so wide, it creates a nice soft image around the edges, and that is something that you also get with this as well. So because, as we mentioned, you're getting a much wider field of view because of that curved piece of glass at the front, everything looks nice and soft at the edges, and it draws you into the center of what you have in focus. So you can see around some of the images I took, around the edges, the trees are nice and soft, and that is a typical characteristic of an anamorphic lens, as well as all the other features such as the wider field of view, the oval shaped bokeh, and the lens flares. And it's just another one of those things that goes towards recognizing an anamorphic lens, and it is something that you see in all of these big Hollywood movies as well, where they are using very expensive kit and anamorphic lenses. You do get those nice soft images around the edges, and it just looks so good. Obviously not the same with this, but it's the same theory behind it in a way. So overall, I am fairly impressed with what you can do with this. You can get some good results with it. If you use an iPhone to film your videos, you might really be interested in this. I'm not a huge fan of mobile cinematography, but you can get some really good results with it. I would recommend using an ND filter if you want to stick to the 180-degree rule to get that nice motion blur. I don't have an ND filter that will fit on top of this. However, you can buy them. What I had to do when I was filming my footage before was I had to really crank the shutter speed, which means you don't get that nice natural motion blur, and that takes away from the cinematic feel as well. So that is the Sandmarc anamorphic lens. I'm fairly impressed with it. Again, I'm not a huge fan of mobile cinematography and mobile video, but if you are, I probably would recommend this just as another useful feature to try different things out and improve your cinematography, improve your creativity and your videography. Just have some fun with it. Let me know what you think about it. Would you try it out? And yeah, one thing I am actually quite tempted to try out is an anamorphic lens adapter filter to go onto my normal lenses, and I think there's a few different sorts of these. You can get different colors, but what it is effectively a filter that screws onto the end of my normal lenses and helps create some nice flares. Obviously it's not going to give you the same wide field of view that you get from an anamorphic lens, but you can almost replicate it with a normal lens using them filters. And then you can stick the black bars on there, even though they are fake and they're not real ones. We've all done it though, and it looks kind of cool sometimes. So yeah, tempted to try out one of them filters at some point in the future. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click this like button if you like what you see on the channel. And yeah, I shall see you all very soon in another video.
He's in a right strop, isn't he?
Yeah.
Come on. He's going over there. Waddling away.
He's coming back.
This is a duck that's not very happy.
It's one angry duck.